A serene beginning, shattered. In the charming, sunlit town of Willow Creek, life moved at a pace that suited everyone just fine. Nestled amidst rolling green hills and vast orchards, it was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by name. Children played in the streets without a care, and kindness was woven into the fabric of daily life. For Emma Warren, this tranquil town was her safe haven. At 34 years old, she was experiencing her first pregnancy, a journey that had been as joyful as it was challenging. With her husband, Daniel, a former firefighter and now a small business owner, Emma had found a life of quiet contentment and security. That Friday morning, the crisp air was filled with the sound of chirping birds and the hum of distant chatter from the town's bustling farmers' market. Emma stood in her kitchen, jotting down her shopping list on a notepad. She felt a flutter in her belly, and a soft smile spread across her face. Her baby was lively today, a comforting reminder of the little life she was protecting. Adjusting her loose, floral-patterned dress, Emma grabbed her tote bag and car keys. The market was only a short drive away, and she was looking forward to picking up fresh produce and flowers for the weekend. Daniel had kissed her goodbye earlier that morning before heading to his shop. He always made her feel safe, even when he wasn't physically by her side. His reassuring words echoed in her mind. "If you need anything, call me. I'll drop everything." The market was vibrant as always, filled with friendly faces and the enticing aroma of fresh baked bread and ripe peaches. Emma greeted her neighbors, exchanging pleasantries as she strolled through the stalls. She loved this sense of community, the feeling of being part of something bigger yet comfortably familiar. It was the kind of town where people waved at one another from their porches and came together during hard times. After filling her bag with apples, carrots, and a bouquet of sunflowers, Emma decided to stop by the small grocery store a few blocks away to pick up some essentials. She parked her car near the store entrance, her mind occupied with thoughts of what to make for dinner. The grocery store was quiet, with only a handful of customers browsing the aisles. Emma moved through the store leisurely, humming softly to herself as she ticked off items on her list. Outside, however, the peaceful day was about to take a dark turn. It began as a low, distant rumble, like an approaching storm. The sound grew louder, reverberating through the quiet streets of Willow Creek. Heads turned, and conversations halted as a pack of motorcycles roared into the town square. The riders were an imposing sight, clad in leather jackets adorned with patches and symbols. They were led by a burly man with a jagged scar running down the side of his face. His name was Riker Kane, and he was infamous in neighboring towns for his gang's disruptive antics. The gang, known as the Steel Fangs, thrived on chaos. They were known for their loud, defiant presence and a penchant for intimidation. Willow Creek, with its idyllic calm, was an easy target, a blank canvas for their brand of havoc. As they parked their bikes haphazardly in the town square, their loud laughter and the screech of spinning tires shattered the serene atmosphere. Riker dismounted his bike with a swagger that commanded attention. His sharp eyes scanned the area, landing on the elderly couple sitting on a bench, the mother hurriedly ushering her child into a nearby store, and the shopkeeper nervously locking his door. A slow smirk spread across Riker's face. "Looks like we got ourselves a quiet little paradise," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "Let's liven it up a bit." The gang spread out, their heavy boots thudding against the cobblestone streets. One of them revved his engine unnecessarily, causing a flock of birds to scatter from a nearby tree. Another lit a cigarette, flicking the match carelessly onto the pavement. Their presence was suffocating, and the townsfolk who remained outside avoided making eye contact, hoping not to draw attention to themselves. Emma emerged from the grocery store, a paper bag cradled in her arms. The sun was still shining, but the atmosphere had changed. She noticed the motorcycles first, their chrome gleaming in the afternoon light, and then the gang. They loitered near their bikes, their voices loud and boisterous. Emma hesitated, her grip on the bag tightening. She glanced toward her car, calculating the shortest path that would allow her to avoid them. But fate had other plans. "Hey, look at this," one of the gang members called out, nudging Riker and gesturing in Emma's direction. "We've got a little lady here. And she's got company," he added with a crude laugh, pointing at her obvious baby bump. Riker's eyes followed, and his smirk widened. "Well, isn't that something?" he said, his tone mockingly sweet. He began walking toward Emma, his boots crunching against the gravel. "What brings you out here, Mama Bear? Shouldn't you be resting up?" Emma's heart began to race. She glanced around, but the parking lot was eerily empty. Taking a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and started walking toward her car, hoping to avoid any confrontation. "Hey, don't be rude," another biker called out, stepping in front of her. He was tall and wiry, with a toothpick dangling from his lips. "We're just trying to be friendly." Emma stopped, her pulse quickening. "Please, I'm just trying to get to my car," she said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. Riker chuckled, stepping closer. "And we're just trying to have a conversation. No harm in that, is there?" Emma's eyes darted toward her car. She was only a few steps away, but the gang had effectively blocked her path. She felt a surge of panic, but forced herself to stay calm. "I don't want any trouble," she said firmly. "Trouble?" Riker echoed, feigning offense. "Now, why would you think we're here to cause trouble?" The other gang members laughed, their voices echoing in the still air. Emma tightened her grip on the grocery bag, feeling trapped. She wished Daniel were here, his steady presence a shield against anything that might threaten her. "Come on, give us a smile," one of the bikers jeered. "You're too pretty to look so serious." Emma's jaw clenched, her fear giving way to anger. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice stronger this time. Riker's smirk faded, replaced by a glint of irritation. "Now that's not very nice," he said, taking another step forward. "We're just being neighborly." Unbeknownst to the gang, help was already on its way. Daniel, on his lunch break, had decided to surprise Emma at the store. As he turned the corner and saw the gang surrounding his wife, his blood ran cold. Years of firefighting had taught him to remain calm under pressure, but this was different. This was personal. Daniel parked his truck and stepped out, his broad shoulders and commanding presence immediately drawing attention. The gang turned to look at him, their laughter faltering as they took in his stern expression. Riker's smirk returned, but it was less certain now. Well, Riker said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Looks like the cavalry's here." Daniel didn't respond. He locked eyes with Riker, his expression unyielding. Without breaking his gaze, he walked to Emma's side and placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked her softly. Emma nodded, her relief evident in the way her shoulders relaxed. "I am now," she whispered. Daniel turned his attention to the gang, his voice calm but firm. "I think it's time for you to leave." Riker chuckled, but the sound lacked its earlier confidence. "And who's gonna make us? You?" Daniel took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Riker's. "If I have to." The tension was palpable, the peaceful town square now a silent battleground. Emma stood beside her husband, her fear replaced by a deep sense of gratitude. Whatever was about to happen, she knew Daniel would protect her, no matter the cost. Shadows of defiance. The afternoon sun hung high in the sky, its golden rays washing over Willow Creek, though its warmth felt distant in the charged atmosphere. The once serene town square was now a stage for an unspoken challenge, a test of will between Daniel Warren, a man of quiet resolve, and Riker Kane, the self-proclaimed leader of the Steel Fangs. The air seemed heavier, filled with the unrelenting growl of idling motorcycles and the low hum of murmured taunts. Riker's eyes narrowed as he studied Daniel. There was something about the man that unnerved him, not his size, though Daniel's broad frame and confident stance were enough to make most men think twice. No, it was his composure, the way he stood so calm and assured in the face of the gang's chaos. It was as if Daniel had faced far worse than this, a reality Riker couldn't quite comprehend. Daniel, on the other hand, was calculating. He had seen men like Riker before, bullies who thrived on intimidation, feeding off the fear of those they could overpower. But Daniel was no stranger to pressure. Years as a firefighter had taught him how to act decisively in moments of crisis, and now his training kicked in. His priority was clear: protect Emma and get her out of harm's way. The gang, sensing the tension, began closing ranks around Riker. They jeered and laughed, their bravado masking the unease growing in their ranks. Daniel's unflinching demeanor was unsettling, and some of the younger members exchanged uncertain glances. One of them, a wiry man with a jagged scar across his cheek, stepped forward, eager to prove himself. "Hey, tough guy," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think you can take all of us? You're outnumbered, buddy." Daniel's gaze shifted to the man, his expression unchanging. "I'm not here to fight," he said evenly. "I'm here to take my wife home." His calm response only seemed to irritate the gang further. The wiry man sneered. Big talk for someone standing alone. But Daniel wasn't alone. Emma stood at his side, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. Though fear still lingered in her eyes, her husband's presence gave her strength. She straightened her posture, her resolve hardening. "You're the ones who don't belong here," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "This is our town, not your playground." The gang erupted into laughter, but it was hollow, lacking the confidence it had earlier. Riker's smirk widened as he took a step closer, towering over Emma and Daniel. "Feisty, isn't she?" he drawled, his tone laced with mock admiration. "I like that." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. His restraint was deliberate, a reminder to himself to stay calm and measured. Acting on impulse would only escalate the situation, and that was the last thing he wanted. Riker tilted his head, studying Daniel like a predator sizing up its prey. "You know," he said, his voice low and menacing, "most men would think twice before stepping up to a group like us. But not you. Why's that?" Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow step forward, placing himself between Emma and Riker. His eyes never left the gang leaders, and when he spoke, his voice was firm but quiet, a tone that demanded attention. "Because I've faced worse than you," he said simply, "and I won't let you or anyone else scare my family." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the gang seemed momentarily taken aback by Daniel's words. Riker's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. He quickly recovered, his arrogance returning in full force. "Big words," he said, clapping his hands slowly. "But words don't mean much around here." He turned to his gang, motioning them forward. "Let's see if this guy can back them up." The gang began to advance, their boots echoing against the pavement. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she instinctively stepped closer to Daniel. Her husband's hand brushed against hers, a silent reassurance that he had everything under control. Daniel didn't flinch. His eyes darted to the motorcycles parked haphazardly nearby, then to the gang's formation. He was already mapping out the situation in his mind, assessing escape routes and potential risks. But before the gang could close the distance, a voice rang out from the periphery. "Hey, what's going on here?" All heads turned to see the source of the interruption. Standing at the edge of the square was Sheriff Harris, a burly man with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor. He was flanked by two deputies, their hands resting on the holsters of their service pistols. The sheriff's arrival was a lifeline, but it also came with its own complications. Riker scowled, his posture shifting defensively. "This isn't your business, Sheriff," he said, his tone sharp. "We're just having a little chat with the locals." Sheriff Harris wasn't buying it. His sharp eyes flicked between Riker and Daniel, quickly piecing together the situation. "It doesn't look like a friendly chat to me," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I suggest you and your boys pack up and move along." Riker crossed his arms, his lips curling into a defiant sneer. And if we don't? The sheriff took a step forward, his expression hardening. Then you'll be leaving in the back of my cruiser, he said flatly. Your choice. The gang exchanged uneasy glances. While they thrived on intimidation, they weren't keen on facing the law. Riker, however, wasn't ready to back down. He squared his shoulders, his gaze locking with the sheriff's. You think I'm scared of a couple of badges? He spat. We're not breaking any laws. We're just socializing. Daniel saw an opportunity and seized it. Socializing. He said, his voice cutting through the tension. You call cornering a pregnant woman and blocking her path socializing. Emma's hand tightened on his arm, her gratitude evident in the way she looked at him. Daniel's words had shifted the focus, forcing Riker to defend his actions. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. Is that true? He asked, his voice cold. Because if it is, I'll consider that harassment. Riker hesitated, his bravado faltering under the combined scrutiny of Daniel and the sheriff. He glanced at his gang, silently willing them to back him up, but their confidence was waning. The presence of law enforcement had shifted the balance of power, and even Riker could see that the odds were no longer in his favor. After a long, tense silence, Riker let out a sharp laugh, though it lacked its usual swagger. Fine, he said, throwing up his hands. We'll go. This town's boring anyway. He turned to his gang, gesturing for them to follow. Let's roll out, boys. The gang mounted their bikes reluctantly, their engines roaring to life. As they pulled away, Riker shot one last glare at Daniel, his eyes filled with unspoken promises of retribution. This isn't over, he muttered, his voice low enough that only Daniel could hear. Daniel didn't respond. He stood motionless, watching as the gang disappeared down the road, their presence lingering like a dark cloud over the town square. As the sound of the motorcycles faded into the distance, the tension in the air began to dissipate. Sheriff Harris approached Daniel and Emma, his expression a mix of relief and concern. You okay? He asked, his gaze shifting between the couple. Daniel nodded. Thanks for stepping in, he said. They weren't going to leave on their own. The sheriff sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I'd dealt with their kind before. They like to push boundaries, but they're cowards at heart. Emma finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. Do you think they'll come back? The sheriff hesitated before answering. It's possible, he admitted. But we'll keep an eye out. And if they do come back, we'll be ready. As Daniel guided Emma to his truck, a wave of exhaustion washed over him. The confrontation had ended, but he knew the gang's departure wasn't the end of the story. Their parting words lingered in his mind, a reminder that trouble often returned when least expected. For now, though, his focus was on Emma. He helped her into the passenger seat, his touch gentle but firm. You okay? He asked, his voice filled with quiet concern. Emma nodded, her hand resting on her belly. I'm fine, she said. Thanks to you. Daniel smiled faintly, his hand brushing against her cheek. Let's get you home, he said. As the truck pulled away from the square, Daniel's mind was already racing. The Steel Fangs had underestimated him, but he knew they wouldn't make that mistake again. Whatever came next, he would be ready, for Emma, for their unborn child, and for the town he had grown to love. A storm brewing. The steel-gray clouds of dusk were rolling in, casting long shadows over Willow Creek as Daniel and Emma drove home. The quiet hum of the truck engine was the only sound between them. Emma, still shaken from the ordeal, stared out the window, her hands resting protectively over her baby bump. The confrontation had ended, but the echo of Riker's mocking voice and the gang's menacing presence lingered in her mind. Daniel glanced at her, his grip on the steering wheel tightening, as he caught the worry etched on her face. He felt a familiar surge of protectiveness, a need to shield her from the world's dangers. Yet he knew this wasn't over. Riker Kane and his gang weren't the kind to let humiliation go unanswered, and their parting words, "This isn't over," hung in his mind like a storm cloud. "We'll get through this," Daniel said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a steely determination beneath it. "I'll make sure of it." Emma turned to him, her eyes filled with both gratitude and concern. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't answer right away. He navigated the winding roads leading to their home, his mind racing through the possibilities. "If they do," he finally said, "we'll be ready." Their house sat at the edge of Willow Creek, surrounded by tall oaks and open fields. It was a place of peace and safety, a refuge where they had spent countless evenings dreaming about their future as a family. But tonight, the comforting glow of the porch light seemed dimmer, the familiar warmth of their home overshadowed by the day's events. Daniel helped Emma out of the truck, his hand resting lightly on her back as they walked inside. The house was quiet, the soft ticking of the kitchen clock the only sound. Emma sank into the couch, letting out a weary sigh as Daniel locked the door and double-checked the windows. "You're acting like they're going to break in," Emma said with a faint attempt at humor, though her voice betrayed her unease. "I just want to be cautious," Daniel replied, his tone serious. "People like Riker don't let things go easily." Emma leaned back, her hands resting on her belly. "Why us?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "We didn't do anything to them." Daniel crouched in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Because people like that prey on the vulnerable," he said. "But you're not vulnerable, Emma. You're strong. And we won't let them take anything from us." Emma nodded, a small smile breaking through her worry. "I'm glad you were there," she said softly. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Daniel kissed her forehead, his resolve hardening. "You'll never have to find out." That night, as Emma rested, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, his mind restless. He had always been a man of action, someone who faced danger head-on. But this was different. He wasn't dealing with a burning building or a natural disaster. This was a threat that could come in the dead of night, silent and unpredictable. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. After a moment's hesitation, he dialed a number. "Sheriff Harris," the familiar gruff voice answered. "It's Daniel Warren," he said. "I wanted to thank you again for stepping in earlier." "Just doing my job," the sheriff replied. "But I'm guessing this isn't just a thank you call." Daniel exhaled. "I have a bad feeling about this, Harris. Those guys aren't going to let this go. I've dealt with people like them before. They don't like being shown up." The sheriff was silent for a moment. "I've got a patrol scheduled to keep an eye on the area tonight," he said. "But I get what you're saying. I'll make sure we're ready if they decide to come back." "Appreciate it," Daniel said. "And if there's anything I can do, let me know." "Just keep your family safe," Harris replied. "We'll handle the rest." Despite the sheriff's reassurance, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of unease. As the hours ticked by and the house grew quieter, he found himself pacing the living room, his mind replaying the events of the day. He thought about Riker's smug grin, the way the gang had surrounded Emma, the way they had laughed at her fear. He paused by the window, peering out into the darkness. The tall oaks swayed gently in the breeze, their branches casting eerie shadows on the ground. Everything seemed still, but Daniel knew better than to trust appearances. He made a decision. Moving to the hall closet, he pulled out the old lockbox where he kept his hunting rifle. It had been years since he'd needed it, but tonight, he felt its weight as a necessary comfort. He checked the weapon, making sure it was clean and loaded, then placed it within easy reach by the door. Meanwhile, several miles away, Riker Kane and his gang gathered at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a neighboring town. The air was thick with the acrid smell of cigarette smoke and gasoline, the harsh light of a single bowl casting long shadows across the room. Riker paced, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. His gang watched him silently, their earlier bravado replaced by uncertainty. Riker's humiliation in front of Daniel had stung deeper than he cared to admit, and now his anger simmered just below the surface. "We can't let this slide," he growled, slamming his fist against a metal table. That guy made a fool out of us. One of the younger members hesitated before speaking, but he had the sheriff on his side. If we go back, we're not going back to get caught, Riker snapped, his eyes flashing with fury. We're going back to send a message. That guy and his wife need to know who's in charge. Another gang member, a burly man with a thick beard, leaned forward. What's the plan, then? Riker smirked, though it was a cold, calculated expression. We wait until the lights are out. Then we remind them why people don't stand up to the steel fangs. Back at the Warren home, Daniel's instincts wouldn't let him rest. He checked the locks one more time, then moved to the bedroom where Emma slept peacefully. He watched her for a moment, his heart aching with the desire to keep her and their unborn child safe. He knew trouble was coming. He could feel it in the stillness of the night, in the way the wind whispered through the trees. And when it came, he would be ready. Because this time, he wasn't just protecting his town, he was protecting his family. And there was nothing he wouldn't do to keep them safe. When the storm breaks, the stillness of the night in Willow Creek was deceptive. The gentle rustling of leaves and the soft chirping of crickets painted a picture of peace, but to Daniel Warren, every sound carried an edge. He sat in the darkened living room, his hunting rifle resting against the wall beside him. The faint glow from the street lamp outside filtered through the curtains, casting a dim light across the room. Emma was asleep upstairs, her breathing soft and rhythmic. He'd urged her to rest, though he doubted he'd get any sleep himself. The events of the day lingered in his mind, but it wasn't just the memory of Riker Kane's sneering face or the gang's threats that kept him on edge. It was the sense of unfinished business, the gut feeling that the steel fangs weren't done with them. Miles away, Riker and his gang were preparing for their return to Willow Creek. The abandoned warehouse buzzed with a tense energy as the bikers loaded chains, crowbars, and cans of spray paint into their saddlebags. Riker leaned against his motorcycle, a cigarette dangling from his lips as he outlined his plan. This isn't just about him, Riker said, his voice low but commanding. It's about reminding everyone in that town who's in charge. They think they can stand up to us. We'll show them what happens when they do. One of the younger bikers, a wiry man named Trey, shifted uncomfortably. What if the cops are still around? That sheriff looked like he wasn't messing around. Riker shot him a glare. We're not getting caught, Trey. We're making our point and getting out. Fast and clean. Trey nodded, though the uncertainty lingered in his eyes. The gang's earlier confidence had been shaken, but Riker's fury was enough to push them forward. They revved their engines and roared into the night, the sound a war cry echoing through the empty streets. Back in Willow Creek, Daniel's instincts proved true. It started subtly, a faint rumble in the distance, so soft it could have been mistaken for thunder. But as it grew louder, Daniel's muscles tensed. He moved to the window and peered through the curtains, his heart sinking as he saw the unmistakable glint of headlights and the dark silhouettes of motorcycles approaching. They were back. Daniel moved quickly but quietly, retrieving his rifle and checking to ensure it was ready. He didn't plan to use it unless absolutely necessary, but he wasn't taking any chances. He glanced upstairs, reassured by the knowledge that Emma was safely tucked away. He had already locked every door and window, but he double-checked the front door, reinforcing it with a heavy chair. The roar of the motorcycles grew deafening as the gang pulled up in front of the house, their headlights illuminating the yard. Daniel stayed in the shadows, his pulse steady as he watched them dismount and gather near the edge of the lawn. Riker was the first to step forward, his leather boots crunching against the gravel driveway. He looked up at the house, his smirk visible even in the dim light. "Hey, tough guy," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "We're back for a little late-night visit." The other bikers chuckled, their laughter echoing in the stillness. One of them, a burly man with a shaved head, pulled a crowbar from his saddlebag and began tapping it against his palm. Inside, Daniel remained calm. He knew this wasn't a moment for panic. Instead, he moved deliberately, turning off the last light in the house to shroud the interior in darkness. He then stepped into the kitchen, where he had a clear line of sight to the yard. Outside, Riker grew impatient. He stepped closer to the house, his voice rising. "What's the matter, Warren? Too scared to come out and play?" The gang laughed again, but their mirth was tinged with unease. The house remained silent, its darkened windows giving nothing away. Riker's smirk faltered slightly. He wasn't used to being ignored, and the quiet was unsettling. He motioned for two of his men to move toward the porch. They obeyed, climbing the steps with exaggerated bravado. One of them, Trey, pulled a can of spray paint from his pocket and began shaking it, the rattling sound sharp in the night air. "Let's leave him a little message," Trey said, grinning nervously. As he raised the can to spray the front door, a bright beam of light flooded the porch, blinding him. Trey stumbled back, shielding his eyes as Daniel's voice rang out from the shadows. "That's close enough." The gang froze, their laughter dying instantly. Daniel stepped into the beam of light, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He wasn't aiming it, but the sight of the weapon was enough to give them pause. Riker's smirk returned, though it was more forced this time. "Look at you, playing the hero," he said, taking a step forward. "You think that gun's gonna scare us." "It's not about scaring you," Daniel replied evenly. "It's about protecting my family." Riker's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the two men stared each other down, the tension crackling like electricity. Behind Riker, the gang shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado wavering in the face of Daniel's calm resolve. Inside the house, Emma had woken to the sound of voices outside. She moved cautiously to the top of the stairs, her heart pounding as she peeked through the curtains of the upstairs window. The sight of the gang in the yard sent a jolt of fear through her, but when her eyes found Daniel, standing tall and unwavering, she felt a surge of pride and determination. She grabbed her phone and dialed Sheriff Harris' number, her voice trembling but firm as she explained the situation. The sheriff assured her that help was on the way, but Emma knew it would take time for them to arrive. For now, it was up to Daniel to hold the line. Back outside, Riker took another step forward, his hands spread in mock surrender. "You know, Warren," he said, his tone light, but with an edge of menace, "we didn't come here to hurt anyone. We just wanted to have a little chat." Daniel didn't lower his rifle. "Your idea of a chat involves crowbars and spray paint." Riker chuckled. "Just a little reminder of who's in charge." Daniel took a slow, deliberate step forward, his voice cold. "You're not in charge here, and if you think you can intimidate me, you're wasting your time." The gang bristled at his words, but none of them moved. Riker, however, wasn't ready to back down. "You're awfully confident for a guy standing alone," he said, his smirk returning. "What happens when we call your bluff?" Daniel's eyes didn't waver. "You're welcome to find out," he said, "but you won't like the outcome." For a moment, it seemed as though Riker might press forward. But then the faint wail of sirens pierced the night, growing louder with each passing second. Riker's head snapped toward the sound, and his smirk twisted into a snarl. "You got lucky tonight, Warren," he spat, backing away. "But this isn't over." He motioned to his gang, and they reluctantly retreated to their bikes. As the sheriff's patrol car rounded the corner, the steel fangs roared off into the night, leaving a cloud of dust and exhaust in their wake. Daniel lowered his rifle as the patrol car pulled into the driveway. Sheriff Harris stepped out, his hand resting on the grip of his service pistol. "They come back?" Harris asked, his eyes scanning the yard. Daniel nodded. "But they're gone now. For the moment." Harris frowned. "We'll station a car nearby for the night. But you did good, Daniel. You kept them from escalating." Daniel glanced toward the house, where Emma stood at the window, her hand pressed to the glass. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect my family," he said quietly. Harris nodded, his respect for Daniel clear. "I know you will." As the sheriff and his deputies secured the area, Daniel returned to the house. Emma met him at the door, throwing her arms around him. "They're gone," she asked, her voice trembling. "For now," Daniel replied, holding her close. "But if they come back, we'll be ready." In the quiet that followed, the two of them stood together, their bond stronger than ever. The storm had broken, but Daniel knew the fight wasn't over. What mattered most, though, was that Emma and their unborn child were safe, and he would do whatever it took to keep it that way. The battle for peace. The next morning, Willow Creek seemed to wake under a veil of tension. The sun rose as usual, casting a warm glow over the small town, but its light did little to dispel the unease that had taken root in the hearts of its residents. News of the Steel Fang's return had spread quickly, whispered from porch to porch, exchanged in hurried conversations of the diner, and discussed with furrowed brows at the town's general store. For Emma and Daniel Warren, the new day brought no respite. The memory of the previous night was still fresh, lingering like the smell of smoke after a fire. Daniel had stayed up until dawn, patrolling the house and keeping watch. Though the gang had left, their parting words echoed ominously in his mind. This isn't over. Emma joined him in the kitchen as the first rays of sunlight poured through the window. Her steps were slow, her body weary from the stress of the day before, but her resolve was steady. She placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, her touch gentle but grounding. "You didn't sleep, did you?" she asked, her voice soft. Daniel shook his head, his eyes focused on the steaming cup of coffee in his hands. "I couldn't," he admitted, "not with them out there, knowing what they're capable of." Emma sat beside him, her hands cradling her own cup of tea. "We can't live like this," she said, her voice tinged with a mix of frustration and determination. "This is our home. We shouldn't have to feel afraid." Daniel looked at her, his expression softening. "We won't," he said. "I'll make sure of it." Later that morning, Sheriff Harris stopped by the Warren home, his patrol car kicking up dust as it rolled into the driveway. Daniel met him on the porch, his stance calm but alert. Harris tipped his hat, his weathered face etched with concern. "Morning, Daniel," the sheriff greeted. "How's Emma holding up?" "She's strong," Daniel replied. "But we can't keep living like this, Harris. We need to put an end to this before it gets worse." Harris nodded, his expression grim. "I've been working on it. We've got patrols set up around town, and I've called in a few favors to get additional support. But Riker Kane isn't just some hothead. He's smart, and he knows how to push boundaries without crossing into territory that'll get him locked up." Daniel's jaw tightened. "So what do we do?" Harris sighed, leaning against the porch railing. "We gather evidence," he said. "We build a case strong enough to take him and his gang down for good. I've already got some leads, but it'll take time. In the meantime, we need to stay vigilant." Daniel nodded, though the thought of waiting didn't sit well with him. He wasn't the type to stand idly by while danger loomed. As if reading his thoughts, Harris added, "I know this isn't easy for you, Daniel. But trust me, if we rush this, we risk making things worse." Despite the sheriff's reassurances, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that waiting would only embolden the gang. By midday, he had made a decision. If the Steel Fangs wanted to terrorize the town, they would find themselves facing a united front. Daniel drove to the community center, where a group of townsfolk had gathered to discuss the recent events. Word had spread quickly, and the small meeting room buzzed with concerned voices. "We can't just let them walk all over us," shouted an older man named Frank, his fists clenched on the table. "This is our town." "And what are we supposed to do?" countered another resident. "We're not fighters. What if they come back armed?" Daniel stood at the back of the room, listening intently. When the room quieted, he stepped forward, his calm but commanding presence drawing everyone's attention. "We don't need to be fighters to protect what's ours," Daniel said, his voice steady. "We need to be smart, organized. If we work together, we can show them that this town isn't an easy target." The crowd murmured in agreement, but there were still notes of doubt. "What do you suggest?" someone asked. Daniel leaned against the edge of a table, his hands resting on the surface. "We set up a neighborhood watch," he said. "We keep an eye out for anything suspicious and report it immediately. We reinforce our homes and businesses, make it clear that we're prepared. And most importantly, we don't let them divide us." Frank nodded, his fiery demeanor softening. "That's a start," he said. "But what if they escalate?" "They'll see we're not backing down," Daniel replied. "And when they do, we'll have the sheriff and his deputies ready." The room slowly filled with nods of agreement, the townsfolk finding strength in Daniel's words. By the end of the meeting, plans were in place. Volunteers signed up for patrol shifts, while others offered to help fortify the town's defenses. For the first time in days, there was a sense of hope. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel returned home to find Emma in the backyard, tending to the small garden she had started earlier in the summer. The sight of her kneeling among the rows of vegetables, her hands gently brushing over the leaves, filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. "How was the meeting?" Emma asked as he approached. "Productive," Daniel replied, crouching beside her. "The town's coming together. People are ready to stand up for themselves." Emma smiled, her fingers brushing against his. "I knew you'd find a way to bring them together." Daniel squeezed her hand, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "I'm doing this for you," he said. "For us." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, the weight of the day momentarily lifting. "Whatever happens, I know we'll face it together," she said softly. But even as the town rallied, and the Warrens found a brief moment of peace, Riker Kane was far from finished. Back at the Steel Fangs hideout, he fumed over the sheriff's interference and the town's growing defiance. His pride was wounded, and his anger burned hotter with each passing hour. "They think they can shut us down," Riker growled, pacing in front of his gang. "They think they're stronger than us. We'll show them what happens when they mess with the Steel Fangs." One of the gang members, a wiry man named Dex, hesitated before speaking. "What's the plan, Riker?" "The sheriff's watching us. And that guy Daniel. He's not backing down." Riker stopped, his eyes narrowing. "Then we hit them where it hurts," he said. "We show them that no amount of patrols or fences will stop us. We remind them who runs this territory." The gang murmured their agreement, their earlier doubts replaced by the fire of Riker's fury. Plans were made, and the Steel Fangs prepared for their next move, a strike that would push Willow Creek to its breaking point. Unaware of the brewing danger, Daniel and Emma prepared for another quiet night. But as the first stars appeared in the sky, a shadow of unease settled over their home. Daniel double-checked the locks and kept his rifle close, his instincts telling him that the calm wouldn't last. And he was right. As midnight approached, the distant roar of motorcycles broke the silence, louder and more numerous than before. The Steel Fangs were back, and this time, they weren't just looking to intimidate. They were ready for war. The final stand. The roar of motorcycles shattered the silence of the night, their engines reverberating through the quiet streets of Willow Creek like a battle cry. Daniel stood at the window, his jaw tightening, as he counted the bikes pulling up outside his home. 1, 2, 3, 10. Riker Kane had brought his entire gang this time, their numbers swelling with reinforcements from neighboring towns. The Steel Fangs weren't here for idle threats anymore. They were here for domination. Emma appeared at the top of the stairs, her pale face lit by the faint glow of the hall light. She clutched her phone in trembling hands, ready to call Sheriff Harris again if needed. "They're back, aren't they?" she asked, her voice shaking. Daniel turned to her, his expression calm but his eyes intense. "Stay upstairs," he said firmly. "Lock the door and don't come out, no matter what you hear." "Daniel, no," Emma pleaded, stepping down a few stairs. "You can't face them alone." "I won't be alone," Daniel replied, forcing a reassuring smile. "Harris and his deputies are close by. Help is on the way." Emma hesitated, her instincts warring with her trust in her husband. Finally, She nodded and retreated to their bedroom, locking the door behind her. Daniel waited until he heard the soft click before turning back to the window. The gang had dismounted, their shadows stretching long across the driveway under the glow of their headlights. Riker stood at the center, his leather jacket glinting in the light. He held a crowbar in one hand, swinging it lazily as he surveyed the house. "Warren!" Riker's voice boomed through the night. Come out, wherever you are." Daniel stepped away from the window, his hand gripping the hunting rifle that had become a lifeline in these tense hours. He moved to the front door, careful to keep his footsteps silent. His training as a firefighter taught him how to stay composed in high-pressure situations, but this wasn't just about him. This was about protecting Emma, their unborn child, and their town. Outside, Riker paced, his gang fanning out around the yard. Some carried chains, others baseball bats, and a few held cans of spray paint, ready to leave their mark. The air was thick with tension, and even the gang members seemed to sense that this night would end differently than the others. "What's the matter, hero?" Riker taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. "Too scared to face us." The front door creaked open, and Daniel stepped out, the rifle slung over his shoulder. He moved with deliberate calm, his face unreadable as he faced the gang. The porch light illuminated him, casting a long shadow that stretched toward Riker. "I told you to stay away," Daniel said, his voice steady. "You didn't listen." Riker grinned, but it was a hollow expression. "And I told you this wasn't over," he shot back. "You humiliated us, Warren. You think we'd just let that slide?" Daniel's eyes flicked to the gang members behind Riker. Some of them shuffled nervously, their earlier bravado cracking under the weight of Daniel's unwavering composure. "This ends now," Daniel said. "You pack up and leave, or you'll regret staying." Riker laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "And what are you gonna do? Shoot us all?" Daniel didn't flinch. "I won't need to," he said. "The sheriff's already on his way. And the town isn't afraid of you anymore. You've lost your advantage." Riker's grin faltered, his bravado slipping for the first time. He glanced at his gang, his confidence wavering as he saw the uncertainty on their faces. But Riker wasn't ready to back down. "Boys," he called, his voice hardening. "Show him what happens when you mess with the steel fangs." The gang surged forward, their weapons glinting in the light. Daniel stepped back, his hand tightening on the rifle. He raised it, aiming not at the men, but at the ground in front of them. He fired a warning shot, the sharp crack of the gun echoing through the night. The gang stopped in their tracks, startled by the sudden noise. Some hesitated, their confidence shaken, but Riker barked an order to keep moving. Before they could advance further, the wail of sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance, and the steel fangs froze, their heads snapping toward the approaching patrol cars. "Sheriff's here," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. "You've got two choices. Leave now or get arrested." The patrol cars skidded to a stop in the driveway, and Sheriff Harris stepped out, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. His deputies followed suit, their expressions grim as they surveyed the scene. "Riker Kane," Harris called out. "Stand down now, or we'll take you all in." Riker's jaw clenched, his grip tightening on the crowbar. He glanced at his gang, their earlier confidence now replaced with fear. Some of them began to back away, unwilling to risk a confrontation with the law. "This isn't over," Riker spat, his eyes blazing with fury. "You hear me, Warren. This isn't over." But even as he shouted his defiance, his gang was retreating, their resolve crumbling under the weight of the sheriff's presence. One by one, they climbed onto their bikes, their engines roaring to life. Riker was the last to mount his bike, his glare fixed on Daniel. "You'll pay for this," he growled before revving his engine, and speeding off into the night. As the last of the steel fangs disappeared down the road, Sheriff Harris turned to Daniel, his expression both relieved and impressed. "You handled that well," Harris said. Could have gone a lot worse. Daniel nodded, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. Thanks for getting here when you did. Harris placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. We'll keep an eye on them, he said, but something tells me they won't be back anytime soon. They know they've lost this one. Inside the house, Emma watched from the window, her heart swelling with pride and relief as she saw Daniel standing tall in the driveway. When he came inside, she rushed to him, throwing her arms around his neck. They're gone, she asked, her voice trembling. For now, Daniel said, holding her close. And if they come back, we'll be ready. Emma pulled back, looking into his eyes. You were amazing, she said. You kept us safe. Daniel smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I'll always protect you, he said, no matter what. The next morning, Willow Creek awoke to a new sense of strength. The town had faced the steel fangs and come out stronger, united in their determination to protect their home. As Daniel and Emma sat on their porch, watching the sunrise, they knew the fight wasn't just about their safety. It was about standing up for what mattered most. And in that moment, as the golden light bathed their home, they felt the unshakable truth. Peace was worth fighting for, and together, they could face anything. As the first light of dawn painted the sky with hues of amber and gold, the streets of Willow Creek began to stir. The events of the night before hung heavy in the air, like the echo of a storm that had passed but left its mark. Daniel sat on the edge of the porch, his eyes scanning the horizon, while Emma stood behind him, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The silence between them was comforting, a shared acknowledgement of what they had endured and overcome. Yet there was an unspoken understanding that the threat wasn't entirely gone. Riker's parting words had been more than just angry bluster. They were a promise of revenge. By mid-morning, Sheriff Harris arrived again, this time with news that brought both relief and uncertainty. We found their hideout, Harris said, leaning against the porch railing. An abandoned warehouse just outside of town. They've cleared out. Looks like they left in a hurry. Daniel frowned. Do you think they'll regroup and come back? Harris shook his head. It's hard to say. These gangs thrive on intimidation. But when they meet real resistance, they often move on to easier targets. Still, we can't take any chances. We'll keep patrols running for the next few weeks, and I've already spoken with the mayor about increasing community safety measures. Daniel nodded, his mind already turning to how he could contribute to those efforts. If you need me for anything, I'm here, he said. I won't let this happen again. Not to us. Not to the town. The sheriff smiled faintly. I didn't think you would. You've got the respect of this community, Daniel. People look up to you. As Harris drove away, Emma joined Daniel on the porch, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Do you believe him? She asked. I think they're gone for now, Daniel said, his voice thoughtful. But we'll stay prepared. We've seen what they're capable of. Emma sat beside him, her fingers lacing through his. We'll face it together, she said, just like we always do. The days that followed brought a renewed sense of purpose to Willow Creek. The town rallied around the events, determined to turn the confrontation into a catalyst for growth and unity. The neighborhood watch expanded, with more volunteers stepping up to patrol the streets and report any suspicious activity. The community center became a hub for discussions on safety and self-reliance, and local businesses chipped in to fund better lighting and security systems around town. Daniel became an unofficial leader in these efforts. His calm demeanor and natural ability to inspire confidence made him a cornerstone of the town's recovery. He organized training sessions, teaching residents basic self-defense and how to stay alert without living in fear. Emma, too, found her place in this new chapter for Willow Creek. Despite her pregnancy, she was a constant presence at community meetings, offering encouragement and ideas. Her strength and resilience became a symbol of what the town stood for, a quiet yet unyielding determination to protect what mattered most. Weeks turned into months, and the shadow of the steel fangs faded from memory. There were no more sightings of the gang, no reports of their return. The town slowly began to heal, its scars becoming a reminder of the strength it had found in unity. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves began to fall in vibrant hues of red and gold, Emma and Daniel welcomed their baby into the world. It was a boy, healthy and strong, with bright eyes that seemed to take in the world with quiet wonder. They named him Caleb, a name that meant faithful and bold. As Daniel held Caleb for the first time, he felt a surge of emotion unlike anything he'd ever experienced. This tiny life in his arms was a testament to everything they had fought for, a future worth protecting. Emma smiled at him from her hospital bed, her face glowing with love and pride. "He's going to be just like you," she said softly. "Strong, steady, and brave." Daniel leaned down to kiss her forehead. "And kind, like his mother," he said. "He'll have the best of both of us." That evening, as the three of them returned home, Daniel stood on the porch, holding Caleb in his arms. The house was quiet, the air crisp and still. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of true peace. Emma joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "We did it," she said. "We kept our family safe. We kept our town safe." Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We did," he said. "And we always will." The stars began to appear one by one, their light shimmering against the dark canvas of the night sky. Daniel and Emma stood together, their son cradled between them, a family united by love, resilience, and an unshakable belief in the power of standing together. Willow Creek, once tested by chaos, had emerged stronger than ever. And as the Warrens looked out at the town they called home, they knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them head-on, together.